I'm Lawrence Francis, host of Interpreting Wine, welcoming you to the Australia Winemaker Special series. Across these 4 episodes, recorded in December 2022 and January 2023, we'll be exploring the Australian winemaking scene in the company of 4 different winemakers based in New South Wales, Yarra Valley, King Valley and Geelong. Wines from the first 3 guests in the series, Mayfield Vineyard, Rob Dolan Wines and Pizzini Wines, are all represented in the UK by Notria & Co. And wines from Mayfield Vineyard and Rob Dolan Wines can be tasted in London at the Australia Trade Tasting 2023. We continue the Australia Winemaker Special series today in the company of Meg Brodtmann MW of Rob Dolan Wines. She gives us her origin story before taking us inside Rob Dolan Wines, talks sustainability in the Yarra Valley, connection with outside markets. She gives us a virtual tour of Rob Dolan Wines, talks Yarra Valley geology, gives us a closer look inside grower sites and growing culture, talks challenges, especially in relation to the 2022 vintage, discusses winemaking across the Rob Dolan range, and looks ahead to vintage 2023. Enjoy.
Okay, so I started life in the wine world as wanted to be a winemaker after working in immunology. So I was sick of being in a lab, and I lived near the Yarra Valley. So I went up to a winery called Yarra Ridge and asked a young man there called Rob Dolan if I could do some vintage work while I was studying at university, at the Roseworthy University of Adelaide at the time. And he said yes. And so I've known Rob for my entire winemaking career. He has been a friend and a mentor and a boss, obviously. And in 2020, I was in a previous winemaking position and I wanted to sort of move on. And Rob and I always sat around and sort of chewed the fat over coffee and what was going on at a distance, of course, during COVID, although we were what was it called? Necessary industry, a vital industry. So we were still allowed to work because we were in the middle of vintage. So we sort of discussed how education is really key to selling wine. So I came into the role, my title was Global Outreach, Education and Global Outreach, and the aim was to sort of educate people. We realised that a lot of people that are selling wine, that are front-facing, don't really have a lot of wine knowledge, and it's a little bit scary, to learn about it. So the role has grown since then. It started off as just sort of basically doing education, a lot of which was forced online, obviously, and has grown into, title is brand business manager. I'm not quite sure what that means, but basically oversee the direction of where we're going as a business. So in terms of building the Rob Dolan brand. So that's how I ended up at Rob Dolan.
Brilliant. Yeah, absolutely fascinating. And I think what would really, make sense for me and for the listener is, just to, I guess, explore a little bit more about, Rob Dolan Wines itself. And, you've already introduced us a little bit to Rob himself. But maybe, what is this kind of the state of the winery and, the key people that you're working with on a day-to-day basis?
So we're very lucky. We're located in what is really suburban Melbourne. We're about half an hour from Melbourne. It's a large property of 200 acres, but we don't have that entire footprint. We have a small vineyard and our cellar door and then the winery at the back. And it started, Rob's been in the industry in the Yarra Valley since the mid-90s. So he's been there during the whole sort of changeover from the Cabernets to the Pinot and Chardonnays. And he's got an incredible relationship with all of the growers because he's worked with so many wineries. He's built so many wineries in the Yarra Valley. And then in 2010, he had a bit of a career change and wanted to start something on his own. So he rented a small winery. My husband, who's a winemaker, helped him out, and I called them the Two Silver Foxes. They made their first wines in 2010. And that led to finally moving to the site that we're at now, which is a lot closer to Melbourne, and really working on building the brand. So I work a lot with Rob, obviously, his son Ben, who's moved into a general manager's role, and then we have Adrian Santolin, who's our chief winemaker. So we all work together. The styles are pretty much defined by Adrian and also by the fruit, because we don't own a lot of vineyard. We work with our growers, and that's sort of kind of a lot of Rob's philosophy, that he views the industry. Everyone thinks of wine as these small little boutique wineries where everyone touches every grape, and it's not really all about that. We sustain a huge number of growers. You know, we sustain probably 40 or 50 growers by buying in their grapes. And one thing that Rob is notorious for doing, which we keep rapping him over the knuckles, is he buys untrendy grape varieties, because he's had such great relationships with them that he's like, oh no, you know, I'm happy to take them from you. So we make a lot of Cabernet and Shiraz, which, you know, is difficult for us to sell, but of course our focus is on Pinot and Chardonnay, because let's face it, we're in the Yarra Valley.
Very cool. Yeah, so interesting. And, you know, it's something, I have a huge passion for is actually, as you say, taking a step back from the sales process, the production process, and I think just realizing that there are sort of challenges, I think, in that kind of the wine model that you described there, and you know, not least of all, you know, who sells it and how much they sell it for, and ultimately, keeping enough of the money flowing to those people who are doing what they're doing on the land is so important. It's not the romantic side of things, but actually it's absolutely fundamental, because, you know, if you don't have people who are, you know, fairly compensated, you know, who are engaged, who feel valued, and, you know, actually just enjoy what they're doing, then the model doesn't really work, does it?
And if you want it to be sustainable, it has to be financially viable, so that either their children will take it over or they'll be able to sell it to someone who will continue. And that's one of the things that, as a whole, as the Yarra Valley, we're really looking at, making sure that our whole industry is very sustainable, and financial viability is obviously part of that. I mean, as you know, in Australia now, we're sitting on quite a lot of wine. Because of China, that's not really our story in the Yarra Valley. We can't make enough Pinot and enough Chardonnay. We don't really compete in the Cabernet and Shiraz market. But just saying to growers, because Cabernet and Shiraz, we can't, you know, they're not our core products. Can you plant more Pinot? Can you plant more Chardonnay? It's a very expensive exercise for them. But again, it's thinking long term and making sure that they're going to be sustainable, or the next generation is going to be sustainable. Because really, we're only custodians of the land. We think we own it, but if we want to keep growing grapes in the Yarra Valley and have a history of 400 or 500 years, we have to make sure that we're growing the right grapes in the right area.
Absolutely fascinating. And you know, before we talk a bit more about where you're based there, you know, I'm always very clear that the best guests, in my opinion, you know, have always got a sort of an educational slant to them. You know, that might well just be informal. You know, that those kind of people in the industry who, you know, they're just naturally, they value education. You know, that it might be during vintage, but they'll tell you what they're doing. You know, maybe not during the time, but soon after. You know, they're not just about kind of the operation side of things. And I'm curious, like, does that, you know, that little piece of that conversation that we've just had there, you know, about the bigger things about the industry. I mean, is that something that you were able to kind of get through in the education and kind of feed that down the line? I know it's a subtle thing to kind of get out when someone's trying to sell some wine, but I'm just curious how that relates. Yeah.
I think it's becoming more and more important as we see such a shift towards sustainability, corporate social responsibility. There is a shift in mindset. So it's not just about making money now, you know, churning out as many grapes as you can for the cheapest possible price to make the cheapest possible wine. Obviously in the Yarra we don't really do that. But it's about making sure that we're very proud of our region, And so the only way to involve people in our region and get them involved and feel the love that we do is to talk to them in a really down-to-earth, relaxed manner about what we do. And more sustainability is coming into that sort of question. And certainly, from the UK, we have to become more sustainable and more sort of thinking about the whole end of production from start to finish by the time you get the wine in the UK. So we do try and instill that in our staff as much as possible, so that not one person can do it. Everyone has to drive that sort of mentality. And so we have a very young team, and they're amazing. And certainly I'd say people sub 30, a lot of it's just ingrained into them. It's just part of their DNA, so it's not so hard. It's probably harder to teach old people like me to change their mindset, to think about whole of business and getting everyone involved in what we do within the business and external to the business.
It really kind of debunks some of the myths that that I hear, and people still using around sustainability of wine. It's only because it's only a factor of where it's grown. There's just so and for some European markets, it's like saying, oh, okay, it's got to be sustainable because it's grown in Europe. But I think that I think as you've shown there very clearly that the conversation is much more nuanced than that, and I think you can argue that the sustainability, it's not just about how many miles it has come anymore. It's about so many more other social factors, people factors, environmental factors, that it is it's a complex conversation.
It is a very complex conversation. It's one that I think when you get down in that wormhole, you can just keep going and going and going. It's where do I stop? But I find it really fascinating, and we're just finding that it's a global interest now. People are, want to know where their wines, want to know where any product's from, how it's made, but that people are treated fairly and they're paid a living wage and they don't work extra hours, and that the growers are paid, a living wage. So I think we're talking to a smart population. They know, what they want. We just got to be very careful that you back it up with all of your actions, which is another wormhole that you can get stuck in as well, making sure that you can't just sort of talk the talk. You actually have to walk the walk. And, as a business, we are working towards that as much as we possibly can. But it's a journey. It's not a destination. And I think that a lot of people sort of hear sustainability and they do think environmental and they think there's an end point. But the more you get involved in it, the more you realise, actually, it's just going to be an ongoing journey. There are certain, points that you're going to have to mark off as you move along, but I think we'll continue to see it evolve over the next 20, 30, 40 years.
Brilliant. Yeah, amazing. And, I haven't had the pleasure yet of kind of visiting the Yarra Valley and even of visiting Melbourne. So, what I think would be, again, great for me and great for the listener is really to give us a bit of a virtual tour, really, of that location that you've already hinted at, that suburban Melbourne location on a 200-acre property, which for a London boy like me sounds wild, to be so close to a major city, but then also on a big property like that. So please give us some taste of the visual.
During the 1970s, we had a Victorian Premier. So we have our Prime Minister, which is our federal government, then we have premiers of each state. We're very overgoverned. But he decided that Melbourne needed a set of lungs, and so put what is called the green wedge around Melbourne, which were properties that could not be developed beyond a certain size. So I'm fortunate enough to live on one. I live on a 3-acre property, half an hour from Melbourne. I'm 5 minutes from the winery, and we're sitting on a 200-acre property. So if we ever wanted to develop that site, we could not sell off land less than 10 acres. So we had, fortunately, the infrastructure in place, both by government making a right decision, which is pretty rare, mostly, a long-term decision, and they've stuck by it. You know, they haven't let the property boom, you know, make them change their mind. So we're located within that. We have a freeway that really comes 5 minutes from our door. We've got public transport, which is close. So we're in what the property was. It was an egg farm originally called Fantasy Eggs. Very strange name. But our cellar door is located in what was the old egg farm, like the chook house. It's obviously been renovated since then. It's very lovely. But so we have what looks like an old farm homestead with a small vineyard located on this whole 2-acre property. So we're surrounded by the whole property. So there's dams and everything you expect from a farm, but also surrounded by what we call McMansions, you know, houses that are sitting on their 1/4-acre blocks. 2 minutes down the road, 500 metres down the road, they're all 1/4-acre blocks, and schools and shops and everything. So it is a little oasis. So we're about half an hour from the Yarra Valley proper. But because we take fruit from all over the Yarra Valley, so the Yarra Valley is sort of divided into two parts, the lower Yarra and the upper Yarra. Some fruit can be coming from almost an hour away. Other fruit is coming from half an hour away. So it's all brought into the processing, to the wineries for processing. So we, as I said, have these long-term relationship with growers. We work with them to achieve what we want to achieve during the year, and then we work together on when we're going to pick and the styles we're going to make, and everything's brought in to the winery. So it's a really fortunate position, and I think certainly during COVID we were lucky because we were in we had what was called the Ring of Fire around Melbourne. You couldn't exit that part of Melbourne to get to the country, to try and protect the country. So we didn't have those issues. People could still come to our cellar door and buy takeaway, or we have a cheese maker on site as well, so they could come and buy Jack's cheese, and they could come and get coffee. So we still managed to, you know, meet budget during COVID because of the prime location of being in downtown suburbia. We really are like a city vineyard, but it's not like the centre of London like Hyde Park. You know, it's more, I don't know, Hampstead Heathy, a little bit out from the centre.
Yeah, no, it's super interesting. Yeah, I mean, we have our own green belt, so yeah, I guess there's a similarity there, and yeah, even, you know, some of the wineries who are near to London, you know, who are in sort of Hampshire. I think the closest to London is as close as sort of 40. You know, on a good day, it's sort of, you know, 40, 50-minute drive from central London. So, yeah, it's a really interesting. And then, out of curiosity, then, you know, on those sort of 200 acres that you're talking about, there are there then other than grapes that you yourselves are growing on that site, which are then added to from the local suppliers and growers?
We have a small vineyard with Pinot Noir and Cabernet Franc, but we actually reserve that for our wine club members. So every year they come in 2 groups and make their own wine. So that's reserved. We call them the Huddle Club. So the Huddle Club members come in and make their own wine. So that's all we've got. The rest of the property has goats and cattle and, you know, just farmland basically. We've also got a function centre that does weddings. So there's a lot of little business in there.
Brilliant. Yeah, okay. And I think, you know, where the conversation naturally leads. And again, I'm you know, very interested to hear how you'll talk about this in that sort of snapshot, that kind of, you know, high level way that you mentioned already. You know, is actually the geology, I guess, that underpins the growing sites that you're talking about there. So, you know, giving us an introduction to, you know, what is, as you say, the lower, the upper Yarra, and I guess you're starting to make some connections between that and how the fruit that comes out of those soils.
Yeah, so we call it the lower and upper Yarra, although we always have this discussion that people think one's north and one's south. The upper Yarra is actually further south, but it's at higher elevation. So the lower Yarra, where most of the wineries are and most of the vineyards are, was an inland sea in 450 million years ago. And so our soils have been informed by that. We've got a lot of sedimentary and alluvial, obviously, from the river, but underneath there's this fractured river stone. And we have this sort of part of the Yarra that we call the Golden Mile for Cabernet, which is sitting on they're incredibly poor soils. Burgundy soils are, 150 million years old? So ours are 300 million years old, and they don't have a lot of nutrition. So, of course, the old things are forcing the vines to deep root to look for water, which is obviously important in Australia, but also nutrition, giving them great anchorage. We don't get, because they are so poor, we don't get masses of foliage. So all of the energy of the vine is going into ripening grapes, which helps us in a cooler climate. In the upper Yarra, which is at higher elevation, so you go up to about 450, 650 metres, you've got volcanic soils. So they were formed 250 million years ago. There was a volcano that erupted. They're full of iron. They're very rich. Think Chile. They're incredibly fertile soils. If you had the same sort of warmth that you do in the lower Yarra, in the upper Yarra, you would have just foliage and vigour problems. But because of the richness of the soils, but because it's cooler up there, the soils, for me, almost act like an electric blanket to allow the grapes to ripen. But all we really can ripen up there is Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. There's a little bit of Shiraz. There was some Cabernet years ago. Thank God that's been pulled out. But mostly it's Pinot and Chardonnay, and that's where the best Pinot and Chardonnay come from. But if you want the sort of more fruit-driven styles, the lower Yarras probably, it borders on red fruit, but sort of riper, richer red fruit styles, whereas the upper Yarra can be a little bit more mineral. There's a violet character to it as well. I mean, it's all, all very esoteric, but we do definitely divide it up in the winery and in the management, and a lot of people that are making wine in the Yarra Valley, because these are growers, they're not just single vineyards associated with a winery, they'll be buying the same fruit or fruit from the same property. So we have one vineyard called Willow Lake. We're not the only people that buy fruit off, but luckily because Rob's got such a great relationship with the owner and has had for over 30 years, we kind of get the good selection. We get to go first, so which is nice.
Amazing. And I think it would also be, and this is maybe a little kind of fact driven as well. But yeah, that description that you're given there in terms of the kind of the upper and the lower, like, and also the growers, like what sort of size and what sort of scale are we talking about here in terms of on average, or maybe one or two examples?
100-acre property would be big. 1 acre there's a lot of them. There's a lot of people that have between 1 and 5 acres of under vine. So they'd be your small growers. Then there are properties, that sort of have 100 acres. There are a couple of properties that have that size of vineyard and only make their own wine. But a lot of wineries in the Yarra also buy in fruit to meet demand, obviously, and to meet the styles that they want to make. So we are, we had some French people out here last year when we just opened up, and they're expecting massive vineyards when we drove them out there, and they're saying, oh no, this is 4 vineyards, like this is 4 different owners here. There are a couple of big ones, but mostly they're, sort of 4 to 20 acres.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating to get the visual and get the a little bit the feedback of as you say, people coming from Europe and having all of our messages from so many years that we haven't been able to escape. We internalize, we get this image of this sort of fantasy vineyard that doesn't exist there.
Yeah, and I think a lot of, in Australia, there was an image of us being sort of an industrialised wine producing area. And I think you can say that about parts of Australia, but certainly not the Yarra Valley. We just aren't big enough, and we don't have the big companies. We have a couple of them, but they only take a certain amount of grapes. So we're structured very, very differently. It's very much a mum and pop kind of growing environment. Most of the people that we deal with, we had a growers' lunch a couple of weeks ago to say thank you, and it's families. They brought their children, and the parents were there, and it's really, really lovely.
Yeah, no, it's super interesting, and I'm so happy that one of the first things you did was mention and talk about sustainability, because I think all of those things, they interconnect as well, and they absolutely makes sense on kind of multiple levels, and to I guess continue the conversation really along the lines of viticulture. I mean, it'd be really interesting to to understand a bit more, and it will take us more into the project as well, just to maybe understand, what are the sorts of, challenges or, conditions that growers find for themselves in the kind of the upper and lower, and, are there any, particular, elements that come out when you're first choosing sites and growers to work with, but then equally, are there any particular philosophies that are sort of brought out or maybe introduced or expanded on when those relationships are established?
Well, the biggest challenge we've had, this has been the most challenging growing season that we've ever had in the Yarra Valley. That's what everyone's saying for the last 30 years. Some people are saying in the last 50 years. We've had 3 years of La Nina, which just means rain. And while the vines are dormant, it's not really a problem during winter. But come spring, when the leaves are starting to emerge and you need to get sprays on for disease pressure or whatever, people physically couldn't get their tractors in. My husband had to buy a new spray unit because his spray unit was too heavy and he was just digging himself into the mud the whole time. So that has been a massive problem this year. Fortunately, we're coming out of the tail end of that. 2022 was one of the smallest vintages I've ever seen in the Yarra Valley. We did 50% of what we would normally do. Most people were down 50%, which just makes it very hard to make money because you just don't have a lot of wine to sell at a time when Yarra Valley Pinot and Chardonnay particularly are booming, and they were the two grape varieties that were most affected by last season. So we've all got our fingers crossed for a fantastic 23. In terms of
maybe an oversimplification, but does it come directly from the rain and La Nina and I guess the disease pressure or
absolutely. So what happens when you've got obviously you have bud burst, so the leaves are starting to emerge around September. It's starting to warm up. Then we have flowering, and at flowering, the little grapes have got caps on them, and they need to come off. And if it rains during that time, they don't all fall off at the same time. And this is one of the things that people were saying about 2022 and a little bit about 23, with the sticky caps, they were just sticking on. So that leads to that uneven set, which gives you the chicken and hen. So you have some green berries, some really ripe berries. So that's one problem. And if you have uneven set, your yields will be down. The other problem, obviously, is disease pressure because it starts to warm up. It's more humid. There's so much moisture in the soils and in the grass because you haven't been able to cut your grass. It's 5 feet tall because you can't get a slasher in. So it can be a perfect storm. Fortunately, this year, someone was smiling on us and the heat coincided with the rain stopping at flowering. So we got through a really good flowering time, and now we're just going into ripening, and since Christmas really it has been ideal conditions. So you just never know. I mean, there's nothing to say that we also had hail a few weeks ago, so there was damage on the young bunches with the hail. That was early December. It's just what else can go wrong? But La Niña tends to work in 3-year cycles.
Mm-hmm.
So we are moving out of La Niña now. They think we'll be out by about March, which is great for us because it's our picking season. And my very pessimistic husband said to me yesterday, I think it's going to be a good year this year. I think we're going to dodge a bullet. So everyone's sort of feeling the same, but certainly, at our growers' lunch, we had people cancelling at the last moment because it was a sunny day, so they could actually get out and spray. So they could do some work in the vineyard because they hadn't been able to. So nature does have a habit of throwing these things at you. So La Niña, rain, and when it falls is a problem, plus all that humidity putting increased disease pressure on.
Very
and
cool.
Of course,
yeah.
we're working on sustainability, so we want to spray less.
Mm-hmm.
So it's all, how do we balance everything?
Sure. A little, I think, insight into the, for me, the kind of the crazy world of winemaking. I really think that, that is also a really important part of the story to tell to people who maybe just, love wine and don't necessarily, nor should they need to, but they don't necessarily think about all of those different things that, will ultimately, for a sustainable operation, will ultimately affect cost in some years and, in some vintages,
just for hand picking. So last year, because the bunches were so small, so say Pinot normally weighs 90 to 110 grams a bunch, it was 50 grams, but you still have to pick the same number of bunches. So you've got half the weight. So that doubled our cost of hand picking. So it was up to $1,000 a tonne just to hand pick. It's crazy money. It does add to cost. And as you know, you just cannot turn around to the buying public and say, it's going to cost you double this year to buy the wine. It just doesn't happen. So we have to absorb that cost and hope that next year, 2023, is going to be better, which it will be. I have full faith in the vineyard gods at the moment.
Yeah, amazing. Well, and I think it's it's really fascinating. We have delved into 2022 a little bit here, and I think it's absolutely right, and I think my audience will really be interested in that because I'm sure they're following those bigger trends that you've spoken about there in terms of what's going on with Australian wine and all of the sort of the stock and all of those sorts of bigger issues. So it's fascinating to delve in here, and I know it's very early days for those vintages and for 2022, and maybe to kind of close the circle on that conversation. What are all of those factors? How do they then kind of show up in terms of quality? Then, I mean, is that to say that actually all of those things are happening, but then that reduced yield and all of that reduced production? How does that then show up on a broader level in what's coming into the bottle?
So for your premium wines, quality is obviously amazing because they're often single vineyard wines for us. For our True Colours Pinot, for example, which is a 10,000 case blend, less blending options because we didn't get enough fruit. So Adrian had to work really hard to make sure, because that wine doesn't have to be the same every year, but it has to kind of be the same. So the quality, I've got to say, the quality of the wines, they just blended did the final blends, and it is really, really impressive. But there's so little of it to go around that we're sort of having to stretch 2021 as long as we can, so that 2022 it'll be gone in a snap. But big, and also because the quality is very good. Yeah.
That's it. Yeah, everything sort of ultimately comes together. It's a commodity. It's based on a particular fruit. So it totally makes sense that all of those things are coming together. And then in terms of that whole, and you've already sort of started to talk about it there. Maybe talking a little bit about how the wine is made, and maybe I guess, closing the circle again on those different ranges that you've already, started to talk about in terms of the single vineyard or the true colours, indeed.
Yeah. So our true colours range is sort of 25 Australian dollars. So I don't know, about maybe 10, 12 pound in the UK. It is our entry-level wines, and it's all about purity of fruit. We like to say it's just Yarra Valley in the glass. So we can blend across 30-odd vineyards to achieve that style. We want it. There's oak there, but it's very much the skeleton. We hang the fruit over the oak. We don't want the oak to stand out. We just want purity of fruit in the glass. We then have another range called Black Label, which we don't really export. It's more the experimental thing. So in the Yarra, people are adapting to climate change by planting different grape varieties. So that we've got Sangiovese, Nebbiolo, Barbera, Tempranillo. And we take some of that and have a real play around with it sometimes. Sometimes it ends up into a blend. Sometimes we think the wine's good enough to make, and that's kind of our Black Label range. And then we have White Label, which isn't always single vineyard but tends to be single vineyard. And that focuses on Yarra Valley heroes of Pinot, Chardonnay, and I always say Cabernet. Yarra Valley Cabernet is extraordinary. No one wants to buy it, but it is extraordinary wine. So they are obviously hand harvested. They're for the Chardonnay, it's fermented in oak. We then do a barrel selection after aging or fermentation in oak to make sure that they meet the quality. If they don't, they just get downgraded. We have in terms of Pinot, people talk about a lot of stems inclusion. We don't have a formula for anything. We play to the vintage, so we make sure that, in cooler vintages you don't really get lignified bunches, so that woody part, you get that green and you get that horrible green tannin. So Adrian will make a decision depending on what the fruit, how it arrives, and obviously working with the vineyards on picking dates. So, and our last wine is Signature Series, which is sort of the best of the best from the best vineyards, usually only 2 or 3 barrels. But again, with climate change and the last 3 vintages, you have to be very agile in your winemaking. Again, there are some years, like 2017, Franco de Anna, a winemaker here, once said, my kids could have made wine in 2017. We don't have to do anything. Then in 2020, which was a tricky year, 21 was a pretty good year, 22's another year. Each year you have to sort of just make sure you're working with the fruit that you're given, not saying, I definitely have to make this style of wine, and don't be wedded to anything. And I think that's what makes a great team of winemakers. And because we do have a lot of younger winemakers, they often will have input, not to say that Adrian always listens to them, but, we're always learning from them, which is good, and introducing different styles.
I love it. Yeah, it's, yes. Again, I think, bringing really important element of production to light, really. And, long story short, it just goes to show, why there's vintage variation, really, isn't it? And, why these things evolve over time. And, yeah, absolutely. We understand branding and, positioning of different ranges. But again, we're talking about, effectively an agricultural product and a beautifully variable agricultural product, especially with the grape varieties that you're talking about there. So, there's going to be variation, and I think that's the exciting part of the journey, really, isn't it? When you
definitely, and I
go
think
along for the ride.
that's why winemakers are such vintage junkies, because they love that adrenaline of constantly being on their toes and having to decide, what am I going to do in this moment? And often people chase vintage after vintage after vintage, but I think people are a bit tired now. If we have a good 23, which I think we will, thanks to our growers and their sleepless nights and getting up, to spray whenever they can, we'll be in for a good year, I think.
A huge thanks to Meg Brodtmann MW of Rob Dolan Wines. You can find out more online at robdolanwines.com.au. And if you're lucky enough to try these wines at the Australia Day tasting with the team from Inotria & Co., do let them know you heard this episode of the podcast. Please help to amplify this episode and the series by sharing the direct link, which is interpretingwine.com/485. And you can find links to all episodes from the series in the description below. Next time on the Interpreting Wine Australia Winemaker Special series in episode 486, I'll be speaking with Joel Pizzini of Pizzini Wines. So make sure you've subscribed to Interpreting Wine wherever you listen to podcasts to be alerted when the episode goes live. See you then.